Have you ever considered that silence itself could become the deadliest weapon on a battlefield? That the absence of sound might announce death more surely than any gunshot? What if I told you that in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, one man turned the very landscape into an executioner, and 94 enemy soldiers never heard the bullet that ended their lives? Before we begin this disturbing journey into one of the most classified military operations in modern warfare, I need your help. First, comment below where you're watching from. This channel survives only because of viewers like you who believe this hidden content needs to be shared with the world. Hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you stories the establishment doesn't want you to know. Stories that have been buried in confidential files for decades. Your subscription keeps this truth alive. The official Pentagon file labeled Operation Silent Canyon remains partially redacted even today, 17 years after the events of October 2007. What the Department of Defense released to the public was a sanitized account of a routine counterinsurgency operation in the Khost province of eastern Afghanistan. What they didn't release were the after-action reports filed by 3 separate Marine reconnaissance units, the psychological evaluations of 42 soldiers who witnessed the aftermath, and the desperate communiques from enemy forces begging their commanders to withdraw from what they called the Valley of Whispered Death. The story begins not in Afghanistan, but in the ancestral lands of the Mescalero Apache in New Mexico, where a young boy named Thomas Blackwater grew up listening to his grandfather's stories about the old ways. These weren't fairy tales or romantic legends. They were survival techniques passed down through generations of warriors who had learned to read the desert like a living text, to hear what the wind refused to say, to move through hostile territory as if they were part of the land itself. Thomas enlisted in the Marine Corps 3 months after September 11, 2001. His recruiter noted in the initial evaluation that the 19-year-old possessed an unusual calmness, an ability to remain motionless for extended periods that bordered on the supernatural. What the recruiter couldn't know was that Thomas had spent his childhood practicing the ancient Apache technique called ghost walking, learning to move without disturbing even the smallest pebble, to breathe so quietly that deer would graze within arm's reach. By 2007, Sergeant Thomas Blackwater had completed 3 deployments to Iraq and earned a reputation among special operations units as the most effective designated marksman in theater. His kill count wasn't the highest. His confirmed eliminations numbered 31 before Afghanistan. But it was the manner of his work that caught the attention of Joint Special Operations Command. Enemy combatants killed by Blackwater were invariably found in positions of complete surprise, weapons unfired, sometimes with expressions that suggested they had been staring directly at their killer without seeing him. The mission briefing for Operation Silent Canyon was straightforward on paper. A reinforced Taliban unit estimated at between 120 and 150 fighters had established a fortified position in the Sheikhan Valley, a natural corridor that controlled access to 3 major supply routes. Previous attempts to dislodge them had failed catastrophically. 2 Apache helicopter gunships had been shot down. A company-sized assault had been repelled with 30% casualties. Satellite imagery showed the enemy had turned the valley into a death trap, with overlapping fields of fire, carefully prepared fighting positions, and what appeared to be an extensive tunnel system. The terrain itself was the enemy's greatest ally. The valley walls rose nearly vertical for 800 feet on either side, composed of a distinctive gray limestone that had been shaped by millennia of wind erosion into thousands of caves, crevices, and overhangs. Sound behaved strangely in this geological formation. Radio communications were unreliable. Voices seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The local population had abandoned the area generations ago, and even the Taliban fighters rotated their units frequently, claiming the valley was haunted by jinn who confused the senses. JSOC's solution was unconventional. Instead of overwhelming force, they would send a single operator with a specific set of skills and a mandate to employ indigenous tactics. Sergeant Blackwater was given 72 hours to study topographical surveys, acoustic analysis reports, and historical accounts of the region. What he discovered in a dusty anthropological journal from 1963 would change everything. The article, written by a British ethnographer named Dr. Malcolm Hendricks, described a peculiar acoustic phenomenon observed by Afghan shepherds in certain mountain valleys. Under specific atmospheric conditions, sounds could be manipulated through careful placement of stones to create what the locals called singing rocks. A small noise made in one location would echo from dozens of points simultaneously, making it impossible to determine the source. The shepherds used this technique to control their flocks across great distances, creating the illusion of multiple shepherds when only one was present. Blackwater spent 18 hours crafting his operational plan, most of it in silence, staring at the topographical maps with an intensity that unnerved his commanding officer. The plan he submitted was 3 pages long. The last page was marked for eyes only and contained a single paragraph that made the colonel reach for the bottle of bourbon he kept in his desk for particularly difficult moments. The insertion took place at 0300 hours on October 9th. Blackwater went in alone, carrying a suppressed M24 rifle, 300 rounds of ammunition, a climbing harness, and a day pack filled with ordinary river stones collected from a creek bed 30 miles away. The extraction window was set for 7 days. No radio contact would be initiated unless Blackwater triggered his emergency beacon. For the first 48 hours, nothing happened. The Taliban fighters continued their routine patrols, unaware that their fortress had been infiltrated. Marine reconnaissance teams positioned on distant ridgelines reported no activity. The operations center began discussing contingency plans for a failed mission. Then, on the morning of October 11th, everything changed. A Taliban sentry named Rashid Ahmadi was found dead at his post on the valley's eastern rim. According to the testimony later provided by a captured insurgent commander, Rashid was discovered slumped over his PKM machine gun, a single bullet hole through his left temple. The bullet had traveled at a downward angle, suggesting a shooter positioned above and behind him. But there was nothing above and behind him except 800 feet of sheer rock face, a physical impossibility. The investigation of Rashid's death was interrupted 30 minutes later when another sentry, this one positioned on the opposite side of the valley nearly half a mile away, was found in identical circumstances. Same wound, same impossible angle. The Taliban commander, a veteran of 20 years of warfare, ordered his men to take cover and maintain radio silence. He was operating under the assumption that American drones had developed a new guidance system that could target personnel in defilade positions. What happened over the next 6 days would be reconstructed from multiple sources: intercepted communications, statements from captured fighters, physical evidence collected after the valley was secured, and a single after-action report filed by Sergeant Blackwater that remains classified at the top secret sensitive compartmented information level. The technique Blackwater employed was brutally simple and utterly devastating. During the night, he would climb to positions high on the valley walls, sometimes ascending routes that mountaineers would consider suicidal. At these positions, he would carefully construct what his Apache grandfather had called echo stones, small cairns placed to redirect and amplify sound waves in specific directions. The limestone formations of the Shaykhon Valley created a natural acoustic cathedral. Blackwater was simply learning to play the instrument. When dawn broke, he would take up a firing position at a completely different location, sometimes hundreds of yards away from where he intended the echo to originate. He would wait until a target presented itself. Then he would take the shot. The suppressed rifle made little noise, a sharp crack, barely louder than a branch snapping. But the echo stones transformed that subtle sound into something otherworldly. The crack would reverberate from a dozen different points simultaneously, making it impossible to determine where the shot had originated. Some Taliban fighters reported hearing the sound come from inside their own bunkers. Others swore it emanated from the sky itself. "We were fighting a ghost," one captured Taliban said during interrogation. His hands trembled as he spoke, and the Marine translator noted that the prisoner kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to materialize behind him. "You cannot kill what you cannot see. You cannot hide from what comes from everywhere and nowhere." Some of my brothers began to believe we were being punished by Allah Himself for some unknown sin. By October 13th, the Taliban had suffered 18 confirmed casualties, everyone a clean headshot. Every death occurring in broad daylight while surrounded by dozens of other fighters. Morale began to collapse. Sentries refused to man their posts alone. Patrols returned early, claiming to hear phantom footsteps and clicking sounds that seemed to follow them. 3 fighters deserted completely, abandoning their weapons and fleeing into the surrounding mountains. The Taliban commander attempted to restore order through brutality, executing 2 men he accused of cowardice. But even this failed to stabilize his force. The executions took place at noon, in the center of the valley, with the entire unit assembled to witness the punishment. As the commander raised his pistol to deliver the killing shot to the second deserter, a single crack echoed across the valley. The commander collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. The deserter survived. The message was clear. Even your leaders cannot protect you here. What remained of the Taliban unit fragmented into smaller groups, each attempting to find some form of cover that might protect them from the invisible predator. They retreated into the cave systems, placing guards at every entrance. They covered themselves with camouflage netting scavenged from disabled vehicles. They moved only at night, in complete darkness, without lights or fires. None of it mattered. Blackwater had studied not just the acoustic properties of the valley, but the psychology of hunted men. He knew where they would run, he knew how they would try to hide, and he had already prepared positions that covered every avenue of retreat. The stone echo trick wasn't just about concealing his location. It was about making the entire valley feel haunted, about transforming geography into horror. "I was in the southern cave complex with 11 other men," testified a fighter captured 3 days after the operation concluded. "We had food for a week, water for longer. We believed we could outlast the American sniper, whoever he was. On the 4th night, we heard a sound outside the cave entrance. Just a small sound, like someone dropping a pebble. Then silence. We waited. Nothing happened. After an hour, Abdul said he would check the entrance. We told him not to go. He went anyway. We heard the shot. Just one shot. Then Abdul fell backward into the cave. But here is what I will never understand. What keeps me awake now, even in your prison. The bullet that killed Abdul came from inside the cave. It went through his head from behind. We were all behind him. The only thing in front of Abdul was the cave entrance. The only thing behind Abdul was us. Where was the shooter? Marine investigators would later determine that Blackwater had used the cave's natural acoustic properties to fire from a concealed position outside the entrance, the bullet traveling through the opening at an angle that seemed physically impossible. The sound of the shot, amplified and redirected by carefully placed stones, appeared to come from deep within the cave system. But by then, the explanation didn't matter. The psychological damage had been done. By October 15th, the Taliban force that had controlled the Sheikhan Valley had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive unit. 73 fighters were confirmed dead. Another 42 had deserted or surrendered to Afghan government forces in nearby villages. The remaining survivors had scattered into the mountains, too traumatized to regroup. Blackwater's extraction was scheduled for October 16th. He triggered his emergency beacon at the designated time, and a helicopter retrieved him from a landing zone 3 miles from the valley. The pilot later reported that Blackwater looked like he had aged 10 years in 7 days, his face gaunt, his eyes distant. But he was unwounded, and his ammunition count showed he had fired exactly 94 rounds. The after-action briefing was conducted in a windowless room at Bagram Airfield. Present were the JSOC commanding officer, 2 intelligence analysts, a psychiatrist, and a stenographer with a top-secret clearance. The recording of this briefing has never been released, but portions were leaked to a military journalist in 2014. What follows is a reconstruction based on those leaked excerpts. Sergeant Blackwater, can you describe your operational methodology in your own words? The JSOC commander asked. There was a long pause. The stenographer noted that Blackwater stared at his hands for nearly a minute before responding. I became the land, he said. My grandfather taught me that a warrior doesn't fight against nature. He fights as nature. The valley wanted those men gone. I just showed it how. The valley wanted them gone? The psychiatrist interjected. Can you elaborate on that? Another pause. Have you ever been somewhere that felt wrong? Somewhere the air tastes different? Where sounds don't travel the way they should? The Sheikhan Valley is one of those places. The Afghans knew it. They abandoned it for a reason. The Taliban only used it because they were desperate. I didn't kill those men. The valley did. I just played the instrument. The debriefing continued for 3 more hours, but the core of Blackwater's testimony never varied. He insisted, with increasing agitation, that the technique he had employed wasn't sophisticated marksmanship or clever tactics. It was something older, something that his ancestors had understood, and modern soldiers had forgotten. That the land itself could be turned into a weapon if you knew how to listen to it. The psychiatrist's evaluation recommended a 30-day observation period and suggested that Sergeant Blackwater was experiencing symptoms of acute combat stress. The recommendation was filed and ignored. Blackwater returned to active duty 2 weeks later. But the story doesn't end with the successful completion of Operation Silent Canyon. Because in the months that followed, disturbing reports began to filter back from Afghanistan through unusual channels. Afghan civilians living in villages 30 miles from the Sheikhan Valley began reporting strange phenomena. Children woke screaming from nightmares about mountains that whispered their names. Shepherds refused to take their flocks into certain valleys, claiming the rocks had learned to speak. Village elders, men who had survived 4 decades of continuous warfare, began consulting with tribal shamans about protective rituals against what they called the American jinn, who had learned the old ways. The most disturbing report came from a village called De Bala, where a group of 12 men gathered in a mosque to pray for protection from the evil they insisted had followed them from the mountains. According to the imam who led the prayer session, these men were former Taliban fighters who had witnessed the events in the Sheikhan Valley. They claimed they could still hear the echoes, even here, 50 miles away, in the middle of the night, when the village was silent. 7 of these men disappeared within a month. 3 were found dead in their homes, apparently from heart failure, though all were in their 20s and had no history of cardiac problems. The other 4 simply vanished, their families reporting that they left in the middle of the night without explanation. The imam filed a formal complaint with the provincial government, which was forwarded to coalition forces, which eventually reached the desk of a Marine Corps intelligence analyst named Captain Jennifer Morrison. Morrison had been tasked with monitoring potential psychological operations blowback, instances where fear tactics employed against enemy forces might begin affecting civilian populations. What she found in the Dehbala case troubled her enough to begin a deeper investigation. "I started pulling reports from across Regional Command East," Morrison would later testify before a closed Senate Intelligence Committee hearing in 2010. "What I discovered was a pattern of acoustic anomalies, psychological disturbances, and unexplained casualties that stretched across 5 provinces and appeared to correlate with Sergeant Blackwater's deployment history." Morrison's investigation was unofficial and conducted during her off-duty hours. She had learned early in her military career that certain inquiries, when conducted through official channels, had a way of disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. She started with the basics, cross-referencing Blackwater's confirmed deployments with after-action reports that mentioned unusual circumstances or psychological effects on enemy forces. The first case she found was from 2006, during Blackwater's second Iraq deployment. A Marine platoon had been engaged in urban combat in Ramadi when they came under fire from a well-fortified position in a 3-story building. Standard rules of engagement called for either air support or a Bradley fighting vehicle to reduce the structure. But the company commander had requested specialized marksman support, and Blackwater had been assigned to the unit just 3 days prior. The after-action report was clinical. Enemy position neutralized with minimal collateral damage. 15 confirmed enemy KIA. Friendly forces, 0 casualties. Specialist Blackwater employed precision fire from an elevated position. But Morrison found something else in the battalion intelligence logs. A captured insurgent had been interrogated 3 days after the battle. The insurgent, who had been wounded and captured in a separate engagement, claimed to be one of only 2 survivors from the building where Blackwater had been operating. "He kept saying the building was screaming," the interrogator's notes recorded. Subject insisted that he and his fellow fighters heard voices coming from the walls, calling their names, telling them where the American shooter was located. But every time they moved to return fire in that direction, the voice would come from somewhere else. Subject claims that his fellow fighters began shooting at each other because they believed they had been infiltrated by American Special Forces moving through the walls themselves. When I pressed Subject on this clearly fantastical account, he became agitated and stated, "The building knew we were there. The building wanted us dead." Morrison found 7 more cases over the next 3 weeks. Each one involved Blackwater. Each one featured enemy forces reporting acoustic phenomena that their training and experience couldn't explain. Voices that came from multiple directions. Sounds that seemed to originate from impossible locations. A sense that the environment itself had become hostile, that walls and rocks and earth were conspiring against them. But it was the 8th case that made Morrison realize she had stumbled onto something far more disturbing than creative battlefield tactics. In January 2007, 3 months before his deployment to Afghanistan, Blackwater had been temporarily assigned to a joint task force operating in the Anbar province. The task force was conducting counterinsurgency operations against an al-Qaeda cell that had been particularly effective at evading capture. Intelligence indicated the cell was operating from a network of underground tunnels near the town of Haditha. The operation to clear the tunnels was planned as a standard infantry assault supported by combat engineers. But 2 days before the scheduled operation, the task force commander received a request from JSOX asking if they would accept specialized support from a lone operator with unique skill sets. The commander, skeptical but desperate, after 3 failed attempts to root out the al-Qaeda cell, agreed. Blackwater went into the tunnels alone at dusk. The extraction window was set for dawn. No radio contact. No backup. Just one man in 3 miles of underground passages that the enemy had been fortifying for months. At 0600 hours, Blackwater emerged from the tunnel entrance. Behind him, the underground complex was silent. The task force sent in a clearance team expecting to find barricaded positions, booby traps, and determined resistance. What they found instead was a massacre. 17 Al-Qaeda fighters dead. Not killed in combat. Killed while running. Killed while hiding. Killed while apparently trying to claw their way through solid rock to escape from something that was chasing them through the darkness. The forensic analysis showed that several of the men had died from heart failure, brought on by extreme stress. The others had been shot, but the angles of the wounds suggested they had been running in complete panic. Not taking cover, not returning fire, just running through the pitch-black tunnels as if pursued by something they couldn't see but could hear getting closer and closer. One man had survived. He was found unconscious in a side passage, apparently having struck his head while fleeing in darkness. When he was revived, he began screaming. The screaming continued for 14 hours until he was sedated. During his lucid moments, he kept repeating the same phrase in Arabic. "The stones have mouths. The stones have mouths. The stones have mouths." Morrison attempted to interview Blackwater directly, but was informed that he was deployed on classified operations and unavailable for consultation. She then made the mistake of filing a formal inquiry through intelligence channels, requesting a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Sergeant Blackwater and an investigation into his operational methodologies. The response came 72 hours later in the form of a visit from 2 men in civilian clothing who identified themselves as contractors working for a Department of Defense Special Access Program. They confiscated all of Morrison's research, deleted her computer files, and informed her that any further investigation into Sergeant Blackwater or related operations would be considered a violation of national security regulations. Morrison was reassigned to a logistics posting in Kuwait 2 weeks later. But Morrison wasn't the only one asking questions. In the summer of 2008, a freelance journalist named Marcus Webb began investigating rumors of a mysterious Marine sniper whose operations had acquired an almost supernatural reputation among insurgent groups in Iraq and Afghanistan. Webb had spent 6 years covering the wars and had developed sources within both the military and various insurgent organizations. What he heard didn't make sense. Stories about a man who could shoot from positions that didn't exist. A man who could make the earth itself fight for him. A man whose victims often died not from bullets, but from sheer terror. Webb's investigation led him to interview 3 former Taliban fighters who had been granted asylum in European countries after cooperating with coalition forces. All 3 men, interviewed separately in different countries, told remarkably similar stories about the events in the Sheikhan Valley. They described not just Blackwater's tactical brilliance, but something more disturbing. They claimed that after the operation concluded, coalition forces had gone through the valley collecting something. Not bodies, not weapons, stones. They brought in helicopters with special equipment, one former fighter said during an interview Webb recorded in Frankfurt, Germany. They spent 3 days in that valley with metal detectors and electronic devices, mapping the rock walls, removing specific stones from specific locations. We heard about this from the villagers who watched from a distance. They were erasing something. They were removing the evidence that the valley had been taught to kill. Webb attempted to verify this claim through official channels and was met with denials. The Department of Defense stated that no such cleanup operation had occurred, but Webb found satellite imagery from a commercial provider that showed unusual activity in the Sheikhan Valley during the week following Operation Silent Canyon. heavy-lift helicopters making multiple trips, personnel in the valley working in systematic grid patterns, and, most tellingly, seismic sensors detecting multiple small explosions consistent with demolition charges used to collapse cave entrances. Webb's article was published in 2009 in a European investigative journalism magazine. It attracted minimal attention in the United States, where the wars had become background noise to a public exhausted by a decade of conflict. But it caught the attention of Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico who specialized in indigenous warfare techniques and their applications in modern conflict. Dr. Chen had been researching Apache military traditions for 15 years and had published extensively on the sophisticated acoustic and environmental manipulation techniques employed by Apache warriors in the 19th century. When she read Webb's article, particularly the description of the stone arrangements and acoustic effects, she recognized something that made her blood run cold. What this article described wasn't tactical innovation, Dr. Chen stated during a lecture at Stanford University in 2011. It was something much older. The Apache people, my people, developed over centuries a profound understanding of how landscape and sound could be weaponized. But there were techniques that were intentionally not passed down, methods that the elders deemed too dangerous because they didn't just affect the enemy, they affected the warrior who employed them. The acoustic manipulation described in the Shakhan Valley matches descriptions from restricted oral histories, techniques that were supposed to have been lost when the last traditional war chiefs died in the early 1900s. Dr. Chen attempted to contact Sergeant Blackwater through military channels. Her requests were denied. She then tried to travel to New Mexico to interview elders in the Mescalero Apache community who might have knowledge of traditional techniques. Before she could make the trip, her university research grant was abruptly terminated, and she received an unofficial visit from 2 federal agents who suggested that her research into certain military applications of indigenous knowledge might be endangering operational security. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in 2012, when a diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks revealed a confidential communication between the U.S. Embassy in Kabul and the State Department. The cable, dated November 2007, discussed concerns raised by the Afghan Interior Ministry about coalition special operations in eastern provinces. Buried in the 3rd paragraph was a single sentence that received no media attention, but sent chills through the small community of researchers tracking the Blackwater story. Afghan government sources report that certain coalition operations have employed psychological warfare techniques derived from indigenous tribal practices, resulting in long-term psychological effects on both enemy combatants and civilian populations in affected areas. Interior Ministry has requested that such techniques be discontinued due to cultural sensitivity concerns and potential violations of traditional spiritual protocols. The cable was classified. The response from the State Department was not included in the leak. But 6 months after the cable was sent, Sergeant Thomas Blackwater was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps with full benefits and disappeared from public record. Attempts to locate Blackwater have failed. He has no social media presence, no driver's license issued after 2008, no tax records, no property ownership. One rumor, impossible to verify, claims he returned to the Mescalero Apache Reservation and lives in the remote mountains, speaking to no one. Another rumor, equally unverifiable, suggests he was recruited into a deep black special access program that continues to employ his unique skill set in operations that will never be acknowledged. But there's a third possibility that nobody wants to consider. That Sergeant Thomas Blackwater didn't disappear by choice, that the techniques he rediscovered and employed so effectively came with a price that wasn't understood until it was too late. Dr. Chen's research into restricted Apache oral histories included fragmentary accounts of warriors who had mastered certain forbidden techniques, men who became so attuned to the land's hostile potential that they could no longer distinguish between the battlefield and home, who heard echoes everywhere, who saw every landscape as a weapon waiting to be deployed. There's a reason these techniques weren't passed down, Dr. Chen said in her Stanford lecture. They were developed during centuries of guerrilla warfare against Spanish, Mexican, and American forces. They worked. They worked terrifyingly well. But the warriors who employed them often didn't survive, not physically, but psychologically. They had changed something in themselves that couldn't be unchanged. They had learned to hear the world in a way that human beings aren't meant to hear it. In 2015, a hiker in the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico reported finding an unusual arrangement of stones in a remote canyon. The stones were positioned in a specific geometric pattern that created strange acoustic effects. When the hiker spoke, his voice echoed from multiple points, making it impossible to determine where he was standing. He reported the find to the U.S. Forest Service, concerned that it might be some kind of archaeological site that should be preserved. When Forest Service rangers arrived at the location 3 days later, the stones had been removed. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, but no explanation was ever provided. The hiker's report was filed and forgotten. The Shaykhon Valley in Afghanistan remains abandoned. Coalition forces never established a permanent presence there, despite its strategic location. Afghan government officials who were asked about the valley give vague answers about geological instability and unreliable water sources. The few shepherds who still graze their flocks in the surrounding mountains avoid the valley completely, claiming it brings bad dreams. And sometimes, on certain nights when the wind blows in from the mountains, villagers in the surrounding area report hearing sounds that shouldn't be possible. Clicking noises, footsteps on stone, and very rarely, a single sharp crack that echoes from a dozen directions at once, the sound of a shot fired by a weapon that isn't there, by a shooter who can't be seen, in a war that supposedly ended years ago. Captain Jennifer Morrison retired from the Marine Corps in 2013 and now teaches military history at a small college in Virginia. She doesn't talk about her investigation into Sergeant Blackwater, but colleagues report that she refuses to hike in mountainous terrain and becomes visibly uncomfortable in environments with unusual acoustic properties. Marcus Webb continued investigating military operations for 2 years after his article was published. In 2011, he traveled to Afghanistan to follow up on additional reports about acoustic warfare techniques. He was killed by an improvised explosive device in Kabul, though some observers noted that the device detonated in an area that had been cleared by bomb disposal teams just 3 hours earlier. Dr. Sarah Chen's research into indigenous warfare techniques was never completed. Her university refused to restore her funding, citing concerns about the ethical implications of her work. She left academia in 2014, and her current whereabouts are unknown. Sergeant Thomas Blackwater, if he still lives, would be 43 years old today. 94 confirmed kills in 7 days remains an unofficial record, one that will never appear in any military history book or medal citation. The technique he employed, the stone echo trick that turned an entire valley into a killing ground, exists now only in classified after-action reports and the nightmares of men who survived it. But here's what should keep you awake tonight. What if Blackwater wasn't the first? What if he was simply the first in the modern era to rediscover something that had been used before by warriors who understood that the deadliest weapon isn't the gun in your hand, but the land beneath your feet? And what if, right now, in conflicts happening in forgotten corners of the world, other soldiers are learning these techniques, teaching the mountains to hunt, showing the valleys how to kill. The Department of Defense officially denies that any operations matching the description of Operation Silent Canyon ever occurred. They deny that Sergeant Thomas Blackwater was ever deployed to the Shaykhon Valley. They deny that acoustic manipulation techniques derived from indigenous warfare traditions are part of any military training program. But they've never denied that 94 enemy combatants died in that valley over 7 days. They've never denied that something happened there that changed how certain special operations units think about the battlefield. And they've never explained why, after Operation Silent Canyon concluded, funding for a classified research program called Project Echo Stone increased by 300%. The truth is buried in classified files that won't be declassified for another 50 years. By then, everyone involved will be dead. The questions will remain unanswered. And somewhere, maybe in the mountains of New Mexico, maybe in the valleys of Afghanistan, maybe in territories we haven't fought in yet, the stones are listening. The stones are learning. The stones are waiting for someone to teach them how to speak again. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Sergeant Blackwater's achievement isn't what he did. It's what his success proved was possible. That with the right knowledge, the right training, the right mindset, a single human being can transform inert geology into conscious malice. That the boundary between natural and supernatural, between terrain and sentience, is thinner than we want to believe. If you're watching this video because you think war is about superior firepower and technological advantage, you're only seeing half the picture. The real war, the war that has been fought for thousands of years, is about something much more primal. It's about who can make the world itself into an ally. Who can teach the rocks to remember? Who can convince the mountains that there is an enemy that needs to be destroyed? Sergeant Thomas Blackwater learned that lesson in the most remote corners of Afghanistan. Whether he survived that knowledge, whether anyone could survive that knowledge, remains an open question. But before you dismiss this as just another war story, another tale of a sniper who got lucky and killed a lot of enemies, ask yourself this: have you ever been somewhere that felt wrong? Somewhere the sounds didn't travel the way they should? Somewhere you couldn't shake the feeling that the landscape was watching you, waiting for something? If you have, then you've already felt what 94 Taliban fighters felt in their final moments. The understanding that sometimes, in certain places, under certain conditions, the earth itself can become predatory. And that understanding, once you have it, is impossible to forget. In a world that grows darker by the day, where we struggle to understand the forces that shape our lives and the conflicts that define our era, it becomes clear that human wisdom alone is insufficient. The techniques Sergeant Blackwater employed came from a tradition older than written history. But even those ancient warriors knew they were playing with forces they couldn't fully control. There is a power greater than any military tactic, greater than any weapon, greater than any manipulation of the natural world. It is the power of faith, the protection that comes from walking in the light of God and following the teachings of Jesus Christ. In the darkness of that Afghan valley, men learned what happens when we rely solely on our own cleverness, our own strength, our own ability to weaponize creation. But there is another way, a path that leads not to victory through domination, but to peace through surrender to a higher power. Whatever horrors you've witnessed, whatever darkness you've experienced, know that you are not alone in it. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. Find the light that no stone echo can extinguish, the peace that no weapon can disturb. This is not weakness. This is the only strength that truly endures.